Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
But much of the political debate seems to me still to be shaped by this East-West matter, the competition with the Soviet Union, the great concern over the arms race and so on. So much of our foreign policy, of course, has to be dominated by these kinds of considerations.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Thomas Murray, who is an attorney and politician from Sandusky, Ohio. Father Bacik and Mr. Murray will discuss U.S.-Soviet relations, the political dimension. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Tom, you and I have had some of the more stimulating intellectual conversations that I can remember over the years. I find you to be a brilliant conversationalist, as a matter of fact. And what I want to do is put you on the spot now to make sure that you can come through in that way. Are you ready for a little serious conversation?
Well, you certainly have me on the spot. And when one is on the spot, one better get serious.
That's right. And so I have a serious topic to deal with, Tom, and that is the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And I have chosen you to discuss this topic with me because of your experience. I happen to know that you went out of your way to try to learn Russian in order to be able to talk to people in the Soviet Union. And I happen to know that you have visited the Soviet Union and been in people's homes and had discussions with common people, and that you even did some videotaping there in the Soviet Union that probably not many people would have ever seen anything as you have done. So I have chosen you to talk about this topic because of your experience and your verve for the whole topic, your interest in it. So I'm going to slant it, though, because if I don't, you'll be all over the lot, and I want to come back to a specific kind of notion of the U.S.-Soviet relationship, and I want to talk more about the political aspects of it. I guess the history that comes to me, I think of the Cold War. I think when I was in high school, in the Joe McCarthy era and so on, and in our Catholic Church, I think we have to say this, I mean, there was a tremendous communism bred into us. I can remember the nuns in the school championing the cause of Joe McCarthy. The communists were seen in totally black terms. Soviet Union, as the president has often talked about, was the diabolic force in the world. And I think that has been our general perception of things and has dominated so much of our whole approach to this. I guess I see President Carter as sort of trying to open up a new way of looking at all of this. I think he wanted to see the world more in terms of North-South relationships, that he understood the human rights question. He wanted to make sure that, to move us more in the direction of caring for the underdeveloped countries and so on. I think our popes have talked in that way. But much of the political debate seems to me still to be shaped by this East-West matter, the competition with the Soviet Union, the great concern over the arms race and so on. So much of our foreign policy, of course, has to be dominated by these kinds of considerations. So that, I mean, as a layman in the field, and I suppose speaking a little bit out of a church religious background, that is how the thing has shaped up. And in my own sense is that there must be a more sophisticated way to begin to talk about all of this. As you might know, the current Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, has recently issued another encyclical. He did one on human work back in 1981, and now is in the end of 87 issued another one on social concerns. And he does take up this East-West relationship, and his whole desire is to shape the debate in a new way. Let's not just talk about the Cold War. Let's not just talk about competition. Let's begin to talk about how the superpowers can do something in relationship to the third world. Now, Tom, I have talked 3.5 minutes already, and I should give you a chance since you've come all the way in from Sandusky to do this. So I'm going to give you now 3.5 minutes to respond to my opening comments.
Well, Jim, first of all, let me say that while I may be the only Russian-speaking Irish Catholic lawyer with 7 children in the Toledo Diocese, I don't claim to be an expert on the Soviet Union. I'm a great believer, however, as a lawyer in the benefits of actually going and taking a look. You know, the Roman philosophers used to talk and debate about how many teeth there were in the mouth of a horse. And then one day somebody got the idea they ought to go count them. And they did, and that settled the question. And so that was my idea in learning to speak Russian. I felt that I needed to go, and to get to some real sense of it, I needed to be able to speak to ordinary people, to live with them, dine with them, and to get some sense of how they see the world. Because, only you would probably want to approach something like this from the point of view of, say, Reinhold Niebuhr, the idea that we can't possibly live together as nation-states in the same way we can live together as face-to-face with our neighbors, because the other nation-state is an abstraction. The reality of the other nation-state in a competitive world is not the same as the reality of a brother or husband or a neighbor. They're too remote from us. But history is forcing us to look at it a little bit differently, because today we are brought together by common enemies: nuclear weapons, threats to the environment, the threats of nuclear weapons getting in the hands of terrorists. All of these things are forcing us to recognize that we really are in a global village, and that all politics is local. So that was the context in which moved me to learn to speak the Russian language. Now, you properly said that I could go all over the lot, as I thought you were doing a little while ago.
No, I was trying to focus the discussion, Tom, on political aspects of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union.
But I might just, if you would allow me one anecdote. I was in the home of an ordinary Russian family in Leningrad in the winter of 1986, shortly after Mr. Reagan had addressed the Russian people on television. They were thrilled by that. They said, "Мы видели вашего президента Reagan на телевизоре." We saw your President Reagan on television. They were so excited by that. It was an immense event in their life. They couldn't get enough they couldn't talk enough about that event. So you see, there's tremendous opportunities here for dispelling the myths and the misconceptions that drive the fear, and that's what it is. It's the ignorance that creates the fear that produces someone like McCarthy. I shared the same experience. I was raised in a home where Joe McCarthy was looked up to. My father and mother wouldn't let me go to Harvard, where the guidance counselor at high school wanted me to go to college, because to them Harvard was a hotbed of liberalism and pro-communist sympathizers. And so they didn't let me, and they sent me off, Jim, to be trained by the Jesuits.
And look how well you've turned out, Tom. It's remarkable what the Jesuit training can do for one. Well, I think when we begin to look at this question, it's probably a matter of breaking down stereotypes that becomes part of the problem. In other words, in its one-to-one conversation is probably what begins to change that. I mean, the people in the Soviet Union fall in love and sorrow over the death of loved ones just as we do in the United States. I mean, the whole idea that this is a godless people and so on, really needs to be dispelled, I would think, in one way or another. So we probably could think of a lot of stereotypes along that line. You have the stereotypes that religion is dead in the Soviet Union, which I think is not true. There's a great number of practicing religious people in the Soviet Union, both Orthodox and Catholics, Baptists, Protestant types, Muslims, and so on. And so maybe we need to look at some of those other stereotypes. I know one I've heard you talk about before is the great longing of the Soviet people for peace, and their great sense of the danger of warfare, which has to go back to their experience throughout history, most recently the Second World War, when so many millions of Soviets died. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, your experiences with them and their longing for peace as you dealt with them.
Well, Jim, I think it would be fair to say that anyone who travels to the Soviet Union, particularly if he or she has taken the time to learn to speak their language so that you can really get down to the basics of what concerns them, would discover that there is not just an awareness of the dangers to peace in the world, there is a thirst for peace in the Soviet people. The predominant impression that I came away with in my travels in the Soviet Union was that the peoples of the Soviet Union are united behind one single thought, and that is we must never war again. And you've touched on something that I think every American needs to be reminded of over and over again. The people of Russia, or the Soviet Union, suffered 22 million deaths in the Second World War. In the city of Leningrad alone, nearly 1 million people died. That reality has affected every single family. I did not meet a single person, and I probably talked with 200 or 300 people in the Soviet Union, who could not cite an example of a father, an uncle, a brother who had been killed or dismembered in the Second World War. And so that the horrors, the degradation, the suffering, the fear, the dehumanizing, gut-wrenching horrors of war are not the stuff of movies and television. They are the living reality of the people in the Soviet Union. Now, that's not to say that the American people care about peace any less, but I think we must recognize that our experiences in life shape our attitudes. And we have been an enormously blessed nation, protected on both the east and the west by great oceans, friendly neighbors to the north and south. We're blessed and privileged. And while we paid a great price in the Second World War, we lost 300,000 men and women in the Second World War. Nevertheless, that's a different experience and a different loss than having had that war fought on our soil. To see our daughters and mothers raped by an invading army, to see our villages plundered, to see our beautiful treasures, our churches and our museums and schools bombed and strafed, and to see it firsthand, to have a whole generation of children raised with the horrible memories of these sufferings. You see, we just simply we can't, in fairness to us, we haven't lived through it, so we can't experience it and realize it in the same way they do. And I think one of the things we need to do, however, is, and particularly political and religious and business leaders concerned by the terrible costs that both the Soviet Union and in human terms and the United States are paying because of the arms race, we all need to do a better job of helping each other understand better the reality of the other country's outlook on things.
I think that you bring up that question that's raised often within church circles, and especially by the current Holy Father, that the problem with the world is that we are thinking of it in terms of East-West relationships, U.S.-Soviet relationships, and neglecting the third world, that we have to get another dimension into it. There is the North-South relationship, the North being developed and being more affluent, and the South being the people who are underdeveloped and have a lower standard of living, and so on. And that the Pope's call, of course, is for the Soviets and for the U.S. to begin to think more of being a good member of the human family, of beginning to say, how, rather than fight each other and putting all this money into armaments and so on, can't we do more to help the underdeveloped countries to make progress and so on? So that begins to shape the debate in a wholly new way. Now, one of the things you begin to ask yourself, well, is that realistic or not? I mean, that's a church leader saying to the two superpowers, hey, you ought to do these things differently, but we've got government officials sitting in the two countries saying, we're worried about attack. We have to defend ourselves. We have to be militarily strong. What about Soviet expansionism, for example? What about Afghanistan, and what does that mean to us, and so on? I suppose one of the responses to that is, well, given the right climate, the Soviets come to their senses as well and are, have a desire to withdraw from Afghanistan, recognize in their own self-interest that type of expansionism isn't a good idea, that maybe there's some sort of self-correcting mechanism in their doctrine of controlling the world in one way or another. So, I mean, again, you get the conflict here when I begin to think of it from theological terms, or the kind of religious message that we get. Let's have cooperation among the nations, and rather than competition, let's devote more money to helping with social problems and less to defense. Other people are sitting there saying, but that's not realistic. Politically, you can't do that. We must be strong in the face of the Soviet threat, for example, and look at all their bad behavior, and they don't keep treaties and so on. So I wonder if you want to comment on that interplay at all.
Well, I think you've hit on several points worth expanding upon. First of all, if I were a Soviet, visitor here. My response to your comment on Soviet expansionism with Afghanistan as the particular example of that, my response would be, well, Senator Bacik, we'll refer to you as Senator Bacik. Senator Bacik, the problem I have with that is, aren't you doing the same thing in Central America? Aren't you, for example, you're sending military aid to the rebels of Afghanistan who are fighting across Pakistani borders, moving across Pakistani borders into Afghanistan. You're involved in what we consider to be a struggle to bring political and economic security to a neighbor on our borders. Well, how is that different, Senator, from what you're doing by encouraging the Contras to overthrow the Sandinista regime in Central America? I don't suggest that the cases are identical. What I suggest is that we get absolutely nowhere when we use this accusatory approach. What we need to do more, rather than focusing on our differences, and let's face it, our differences, political differences, and our national interests are not the same. We have deep differences with the Soviet government, not the least of which is their definition of human rights and their police state activities, which unquestionably, by our standards, are indefensible. But nevertheless, I think we need to focus, and this brings me back to your point about the North and the South. I think there is a growing awareness that we are both being forced by the reality of the arms race to face up to certain truths. We know that today the question in the United States is this horrible and growing federal deficit, which threatens our ability to meet our commitment to a whole range of social programs, to our infrastructure, and so forth. And the same thing is happening in the Soviet Union. In fact, there is now formal talk among leaders of the Soviet military about going from an offensive approach to their military policies to a concept of minimal defense, and that's being discussed in the Pentagon today. The evidence is growing that rather than trying to match us weapon for weapon, they're going to take a more defensive policy because they simply can't afford the arms race. It seems to me this opens up an enormous opportunity for us to exploit, for example, the initiatives that have been made recently by the Reykjavik and the Washington summits to work together towards more cooperative efforts in a whole range of ways which can build down the level of fear and misunderstanding, and that in turn can release more and more money within the economies of the Soviet Union and the United States, not just to help our own people, but to deal in a common way, in a cooperative way, with some of the problems which could lead to a fatal confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. I'm talking about, for example, the danger of nuclear weapons getting into the hands of desperately poor people in the Southern Hemisphere. And just to underscore and toss the ball to you on that, a statistic, because I think sometimes statistics can give us an insight and suggest how grave the social and economic injustices are which are caused by this out-of-control arms race. Today, Jim, the United States and the Soviet Union between us each year are spending more on weapons of destruction than the entire income of the poorer half of the world.
It's a striking statistic, and if you put a face on it, you can look at your TV and see the pictures of youngsters in Afghanistan with extended bellies and unable to wipe the flies away from their face, and to get a human sense of what that statistic might end up meaning. I remember hearing Marshall Schulman, an expert on the Soviet Union, talking about all of this and trying to explain, again, in, I think, real political economic terms, the opportunity we have. And that is that his sense was that Gorbachev understands that he can't move the economy forward if indeed so much of their resources, not just money, but especially in terms of talent, the scientific know-how is devoted to the arms race, that he can't move the economy forward. And that this is what underlies a lot of what he is about, that he knows they've got these long lines of people that can't seem to get any food, or they can't get the housing they need and so on. We recognize they've made a lot of progress, but they also have a stagnant economy in many ways, and they need to move forward. And so that Gorbachev is one who understands that if they're going to make this economic progress, he has to cut back on the arms race, and that therefore we have a golden opportunity to move in that direction. Now, that again isn't pie in the sky, church religious kind of talk. It seems to me it does have a real basis in politics and economics as it's actually being played out. It would seem like the American way of doing this ought to be not to threaten the Soviet Union, but to respond, to recognize what they really need, and then be willing to take some initiatives in this regard. We think of the way President Kennedy dealt with Khrushchev and the move to say we were going to cut back on the testing. And then the Soviets, when they saw that, responded in kind and said they weren't going to test either. I've always seen that as a model for one way of thinking about how to deal with the Soviet Union, that maybe the other kind of approach we've taken needs to be modified in one way or another.
Well, yes, I think you've hit again on several points that I'd like to just briefly touch on. Yes, Gorbachev clearly has recognized that it will be impossible to modernize the Soviet economy if he is forced to maintain the level of spending on weapons that is presently being forced upon him, as he sees it, by the arms race. And I think it's singularly important that in his discussions with President Reagan at the recent Washington summit, he referred to the United States at the time of the signing of the Intermediate Range, the INF treaty, as a partner. And that opens up a whole new concept that is being thought out in foreign policy circles these days, the concept of working towards common security, rather than basing our own national security on the threat of overwhelming destruction of another country, our adversaries, the Soviet Union. Why not work together in a range of ways on our common security, not only balanced forced reductions, which Marshal Schulman has talked about frequently, but cooperative efforts also in the area of conventional weaponry, getting so that each side is truly dealt with justly. That word justice comes up over and over again. And the problem that we have today, if we want to go back to systemic or root causes of the problem, is that we don't have enough trained leaders, people who are literate, not only in the mathematics of the arms race, but in the whole reality of the other country, as we've talked about. For you see, if you come to the bargaining table with your Soviet adversary on the other side and you simply have no appreciation of how that person views the world, for example, the greater fear level that they have because of their historical experiences, if you don't have people who are truly illiterate in history and economics and geopolitical considerations, then you can't possibly arrive at a truly just resolution. And the consequences of that are not only a continuing arms race, but a continuing destruction of the efforts within the United States and the Soviet Union to come to grips with the consequences of that arms race. And if I could just make one more point, it isn't just Gorbachev who is faced with the need to get the arms race under control. It's interesting that today that we are running the largest trade surpluses with Japan. And it's also interesting that Japan, because of the history since the Second World War and the terms of the peace agreement imposed upon them, has been forced to spend only 1/7 the fraction of its GNP on military defense as we do. And Japan, therefore, has taken these enormous resources and has channeled them into research and development in electronics, machine tools, and so on, automotives. And as a result, they have created what I think we can all agree is recognized in the world as the highest quality products. And as a result of that, they are beating us in trade relations. And as a result, our economy is declining as well.
It's a great example of what a country has been able to do when they haven't had to spend a great deal on defense. Maybe that ought to be raised up more as an example in the debate about what is possible when we think in other terms. Part of this whole thing is to be able to expand our horizons on things, to be able to think in new categories and not be imprisoned in the past. I mean, we're sitting here with this notion that we're dealing with the satanic empire. I think from the Soviet side, there's a history also involved here. There's a history of being invaded by the more powerful Europeans. There's a history of being put down culturally by the Europeans. I think that, my own sense, layman's sense again, is that there's a certain sense of inferiority that's been bred in to the Soviet Union because of the supercilious attitude taken by Westerners in relationship to them. And I think that has to be factored in as well. I mean, a lot of times they can't afford to lose face. They can't afford to be seen as the weaker partner. They need respect, in a sense, in the world community. And that respect, so maybe, when we begin to think about how we're going to deal with them, that's probably needs to be brought into the whole picture.
Well, I think you've hit on an extremely central question, and that is if I could use the term ethnocentricity, which we often bring to relations one-on-one with people in the Soviet Union. I saw it over and over and over again. We Americans approach other countries with the sense that we are number one. And while we have a great deal to be proud of, and why I think it's healthy that we think of ourselves as number one, and I want to always struggle and strive as a citizen of the United States to keep America number one, nevertheless, I think, Jim, we have to recognize when we sit down opposite people in other countries that they have a history and a culture and achievements that they're proud of. And frequently, America comes and tends to equate our material prosperity, which is an accident of history. It's because of in many respects, yes, the tremendous resourcefulness of our people, but that resourcefulness was liberated by the opportunities which came from the fact that we were protected, as we've talked about, on all sides. We've had advantages as a country. We've achieved great things, but we also must be prepared in fairness and justice to recognize the achievements of other countries. And I think sometimes we don't do that, and it gets in the way of meaningful and important agreements on matters of common concern, which could lead to greater peace and security in relations, not only with the Soviet Union, but other countries as well.
Tom, you and I could talk about this all day and not confine it to one program. That's very clear. I'm amazed at the command of the history and the culture and the facts that you have in relationship to the Soviet Union. I think that's something that we as a culture need to really build up. We need more good knowledge of what is happening if we're going to deal well with these problems. From the moral theological viewpoint, we want to think in terms of justice. We have responsibilities to the third world, and I think that really heightens the need to understand the relationship with the Soviet Union.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Thomas Murray, who was a lawyer and politician from Sandusky, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was U.S.-Soviet relations, the political dimension. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.